Do you remember your first ride? You know, the first mode of transportation that gave you a newfound freedom when you were younger. Stick with me for a few minutes while I go back in time and explore some great memories. Hello, I'm your host, Gary Neidert, and welcome to My First Ride podcast. Today I'm going to go back into the late 60s and talk about a car you may never have ever heard about. It's the AMX 3, from American Motors Corporation, the company that produced the Gremlin, and the Javelin, and the Pacer. This was a totally different kind of car. When doing the research for this episode, I discovered some really interesting information about the American Motors Corporation. I know you're going to enjoy this story, so let's just get right on into it. Now, this comes from like on some of these others before, it comes from 365daysofmotoring.com. You can go there to read a short article on the AMX3. And for more detailed information, you can actually go to Wikipedia and read information about American Motors and about the AMX3. And I'll have the links in the show notes. So let's go in here and just dive right in. On March 23rd of 1970, American Motors introduced the AMX3, an upscale sports car in Rome, Italy. American Motors, an upscale sports car. Can you imagine that? However, production ended after 6 pre-production prototypes. And the prototypes used the AMC 390 cubic inch V8 and an Italian OTO Melara 4-speed transaxle. Road testing was done by BMW, which they declared the AMX3's chassis one of the stiffest and most neutral handling they had ever tested. Imagine BMW making that comment. 5 completed cars were produced before the U.S. $2 million program was canceled. Escalating cost and pending bumper regulations put a stop to the mid-engine AMX3. And the remaining extra parts were used by Bizzarini collaborator Salvatore Diamante to assemble a 6th car. So let's go into Wikipedia. They go into a whole lot more detail. And I recommend that you actually go and check out the link on this because there's a lot more cool information than what I'm going to talk about. I'm just trying to do the highlights here. But the American Motors AMC AMX 3. And like I said before, it's a mid-engine sports car made by American Motors Corporation. And let's go and talk about some of a brief background of American Motors. It was an American automobile manufacturing company formed by the merger of Nash Kelvinator Corporation and Hudson Motor Car Company on May 1st, 1954. At the time, it was the largest corporate merger in U.S. history. Imagine that. Nash, I've heard of Nash, but I didn't know that Nash Kelvinator merged with Hudson Motor Car. You know, the Hudson Hornet. If you've ever watched Cars, the first movie of Cars, and part of the plot includes the Hudson Hornet, which was a unique car for that day. Well, they merged with Nash Kelvinator and became American Motors Corporation. Now, American Motors' most similar competitors were those automakers who held similar annual sales, such as Studebaker, Packard, Kaiser. You ever heard of Kaiser? Willys Overland. And so that made up their closest competitors. Now, American Motors' largest competitors were the big three: Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. And American Motors' production line included small cars like the Rambler American, which began as the Nash Rambler in 1950, the Hornet, Gremlin, and Pacer. Intermediate and full-size cars included the Ambassador, the Rebel, and Matador, along with muscle cars, including the Marlin, although I don't know that I'd call Marlin a muscle car, or somebody did, the AMX, not the one we're talking about today, but the AMX, which was a two-seater that was very popular on the road race circuit back in the late 60s, and the Javelin. And they had an early four-wheel drive variant of the Eagle. It was the first true crossover in the U.S. market. And you know, some of those are really still in demand today. But after periods of intermittent but unsustained success, Renault, the French manufacturer, acquired a major interest in American Motors in 1979. And then the company was ultimately acquired by Chrysler. Now that you have a little more background on American Motors, let's talk about the AMX3 in detail. The AMX3 was presented in March 1970 and was to be a mass-produced car in Germany by Karmann starting in 1971. You remember Karmann, as in Karmann Ghia, the Volkswagen Karmann Ghia. With this car, AMC wanted to counter the similarly designed De Tomaso Pantera with a competitor. The body design and drivetrain came from AMC, and it was a stunningly beautiful car for the time. The chassis and suspension were developed in Europe and was generally attributed to Gioacchino Bizzarini. I hope I said that right. However, only individual components such as the suspension came from him. In addition to Bizzarini, Italdesign, Autoconstruzione SD, and BMW were also involved in the development. I hope I said those right. BMW I got, but the others. Shortly after the presentation, and after about a half a dozen cars had been created, AMC abandoned the project without giving any reason. Several attempts to revive the design without AMC involvement under the Bizzarini brand were unsuccessful, unfortunately. The AMX3 was created in response to an economic crisis at American Motors. As the smallest of the four major U.S. car companies, AMC had suffered significant losses in the first half of the 1960s, which was mainly explained by technically undemanding model range, often preceded as, my word here, dull. They just weren't flashy cars. They weren't inspiring the designs. Near the end of the decade, AMC tried to appeal to younger buyers with sporty variants of volume models, but largely unsuccessful. And introduced for the 1968 model year, they call it a pony car, the Javelin was 3 years late compared to the competition, such as the Mustang or the Camaro. The Javelin-derived two-seat hatchback, the AMX, received good press as an early muscle car. And this one, I believe, really was could be considered a true muscle car, but sold much worse than expected, possibly because of too much stylistic proximity to AMC's standard models. The AMX looked a lot like another model that they had. I think there was a guy I worked with when I was in high school. It was a green car, and I worked for Piggly Wiggly in Denison, Texas when I was in senior high. And this guy was one of the assistant managers, and he had I don't know if it was an AMX or the other one, but it was a really nice looking car. I think it was an AMX. In order to give the AMC brand a sporty image, management had been pursuing the goal of adding a high-performance sports car with a mid-engine to their lineup since 1967. And now this was mainly triggered by the motor racing success of the appropriately designed Ford GT40, which Ford knew how to use for advertising. Not only did they win the Le Mans in France and beat out Ferrari, I think it was 3 times. They used that. They wrung all the juice they could in advertising for that. That kind of put them back on the map. Now, the GT40 had also prompted the GM brand Chevrolet used to develop the Astro 2 concept car. Now, I don't remember the Astro 2 concept car. Don't remember it. Might have been a really cool car. Don't remember it. But this was done in the spring of 1968. AMC initially showed the stylistically De Tomaso Mangusta influenced AMC AMX 2, which was purely a show car and had no prospect of series production. This design was further developed into the AMX 3, which was already a near production design. In autumn 1968, the decision was made to produce the AMX3. Its primary rival was to be the De Tomaso Pantera, which was still in development at the time. However, it was already clear that Ford would distribute the Pantera in the United States through its dealer network. Now, after several prototypes were completed, AMC had promotional photos produced in March 1970 in front of the Colosseum in Rome. AMC presented the car to the Italian press in Rome on March 23, 1970, and to the American press in New York on April 4, 1970. From April 5, 1970, the AMX3 was finally on display at the New York Auto Show, where the Pantera also made its debut. In support, Giotto Bizzarini drove a few demonstration laps at the Michigan Speedway. However, shortly after the presentation, and after about a half a dozen cars had been created, AMC abandoned the project without giving any reason. Several attempts to revive the design without AMC involvement under the Bizzarini brand were unsuccessful. And by then, AMC had invested about $2 million in the project. Now, here's some possible reasons for failure. AMC did not publicly give a reason for abandoning the AMX3 at short notice. Most documentaries explained its withdrawal due to economic reasons. Apart from this, there are also numerous alternative explanations. So here's one thing that they say: the overall economic situation at AMC. Could this be the main reason? I guess we'll never know, but it's a thought. Now, this part's true. AMC was subjected to the longest strike in the country's history in the autumn of 1969, which directly affected the launch of the new volume model Hornet. This resulted in serious liquidity problems at the turn of 1969-1970, which affected all divisions of the company, but had a particular impact on special projects. Now, here's another one, the inefficiency of the AMX3 project. Many authors consider the AMX3 project itself to have been unprofitable. The AMX3 could not be produced in Italy or Germany at the planned cost, and the advised sale price of $10,000 to $12,000, which was already well above the De Tomaso Pantera, could not be achieved. Richard Teague, who had been desperate to release the AMC3 for emotional reasons, had kept the other corporate managers in the dark about the real cost of the project for too long. The AMX3 had been designed without consideration of the tightened U.S. safety regulations, which was already on the horizon at the beginning of the 1970s. Selling the AMX3 in the U.S. would have required extensive customization, which included the installation of safety bumpers. These costs could not have been borne by AMC. Here's another one, intervention by competitors. Now, in part, the discontinuation of the project is attributed to AMC's competitor, Ford. In a direct comparison, Ford had recognized the superiority of the AMX3 over its own Pantera, and thereupon induced the economically ailing AMC group to forego production of the Pantera competitor in return for a monetary payoff. So is this the controversy about the AMX3? I mean, we've had controversy of the last two videos. Could this be a controversy? That Ford paid off AMC to not produce the AMX3? I guess we'll never know. But it's an interesting thought. Other speculations involved Karmann and Volkswagen. Karmann as in Karmann Ghia. Because the production of the AMC Javelin at Karmann ended almost at the same time as the AMX3 project, an intervention of the Volkswagen Group is partially suspected, which wanted to prevent a commitment of Karmann to AMC and thus secure production capabilities for its own models. They wanted to make sure they could get the Volkswagen produced, and the heck with AMC. They didn't want them to cut in on the action. Which you know what, they're in business to make money, and so can you really blame them? I can't really blame them. One final thing: the insolvency of Bizzarini. Finally, the insolvency of Automobili Bizzarini, I guess that was the company, is also cited as a reason for abandoning the AMX3 project. Giotto Bizzarini had significant tax debts from the time his GT5300 sports car was imported into the U.S. According to one assumption, AMC had feared being liable for Giotto Bizzarini's debts by the U.S. tax authorities in the event of a long-term business relationship with him. Now, any one of these are plausible. Any of them or all of them may be the cause of pulling the plug on the AMX3. However, I think it's so unfortunate because it's a beautiful car. Some of the pictures I saw on the internet were just really spectacular. And in some ways, you look over the hood at the very front of the car, and it's reminiscent of Speed Racer's car, the cartoon Speed Racer, because just above the headlights, it kind of sticks out, and the hood kind of comes back a little bit, and so the fenders above the headlights kind of torpedo-looking kind of thing. So it really was a beautiful car. Now, the design was pretty spectacular. It was not able to go very fast in the early days. It would, at 145 miles an hour, the front end started to lift, and so they couldn't do anything with that. But they tweaked it, and they finally got it up to close to 180 miles an hour, which I think was pretty spectacular for the day. But to me, that is a fantastic story. I never knew about the AMX3. And, I knew someone that had a Pacer. I knew someone that had the Gremlin. Here's a good thing. Remember this, the movie Man with the Golden Gun. Do you remember that? Go back and try to find that on Netflix or Amazon, even YouTube, and watch that movie, Man with the Golden Gun. It was a cool movie. And so James Bond was chasing the bad guy, and the bad guy was driving an AMC Matador, and James Bond was driving the sporty model of something. I don't know what the model was, but it was red. It had chrome Krager mags on it and looked really cool. Well, they wound up on opposite sides of the river, so James Bond wasn't able to catch up with the bad guy. Well, the bad guy had James Bond's Bond girl in the trunk of his car. So, James Bond had to go follow after to try to catch up and save the girl. And James Bond had the old Louisiana sheriff in the car with him. So they come up to this point where there is a bridge. It's kind of twisted, looks like a corkscrew, but it's not connected all the way. Well, James Bond backs up, and he's going to make a run at this and do the corkscrew. And this is a stunt. It was actually done, not by Roger Moore driving a car, but it was done by a stuntman, and it was an actual corkscrew where the car went into the ramp, and it did a corkscrew and landed on the other side. It was very cool, very cool. So if you want a little bit of AMC history, go back and see if you can find that and watch that part of the movie. So there we have it. AMX3, American Motors Corporation, and some of the things that American Motors Corporation had done. And there's a whole lot more detail to it. So I recommend going to Wikipedia. Again, I'll have the link in the show notes so you can do that. So what's coming up next on My First Ride? Well, I am constantly searching for people that would enjoy telling the stories of their first rides and how their lives were influenced by them. The story behind the story. And I bet you probably know someone that would be a great guest for My First Ride podcast, right? Maybe that someone's you. Let me know a little bit about their story. And same thing goes for you. Let me know a little bit about your story. What about telling your story on the podcast? Check us out and subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and much more. And of course, you can always go to the website at myfirstridepodcast.com. One final thought. You may not have your first ride, but you still have the memories. It's time to share them. Contact me if you have any questions regarding today's podcast, or you'd like to be a guest on My First Ride podcast. I'm Gary Neidert, and you've just experienced My First Ride podcast. Call me 972-771-7899. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.